All right, this is week number 4 of our Mark study, so let's pray before we begin. God, we thank you for the chance to be together again in this place and wherever we are to remind us that your word is helpful for us and is ready to remind us of all the ways in which you seek after us as your children. We pray that our minds and our hearts and our lives will be open to all you have in store for us today. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so the icebreaker question for today, the question I would ask you is to think about is, if you could be anyone in history, who would it be? If you could be anyone in history, who would it be? As you think about that, think about the fact that we're talking about in this Mark study about how people just didn't get it, how they always didn't quite understand what was going on, and how there were times when it just didn't seem to make sense. And today we're kind of going to do about you don't always get to connect the dots, and it's this idea of the disciples kind of having a little bit of failing faith. And so we'll look at the 12, the disciples, and their struggle to get it, and then we'll look at the crowds as well as we go through these things. So understanding who Jesus was not only a problem for the crowds, it was a problem for the disciples and for the religious leaders of the day and for all kinds of people. They were really kind of grappling with Jesus' identity through all of Mark's gospel. And so today we'll read from chapter 6, verse 30. We'll start there. And it's the apostles returned to Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. Many people were coming and going, and so there was no time to eat. He said to the apostles, "Come by yourself to be secluded, a place for rest for a while." They departed in a boat by themselves for a deserted place. So right before these verses, right before this part of the thing, Jesus sends out the disciples, the 12. He sends them out 2 by 2 with his authority to do their mission work. They returned here excited for them to tell Jesus everything they had done, everything they taught, all that they had seen, all the ways they had been busy. And then, so Jesus then invites them to get away for a little while and rest because they needed it. They needed to rest in Him. There are a few ways that we can interpret this verse, this invitation to rest from Jesus. One way is to read it, there's no rest for the weary. So the disciples had to be weary. There was no time for rest. Their mission was too urgent. Their role was too important. They were doing anything. You can sleep when you're dead and all that kind of stuff. There's just no rest for the weary. And many of us can kind of relate to that at times because we live kind of an always-on, constant checking, swiping, scrolling, serving, and all kinds of things. Always rushed around, always overwhelmed. That's kind of the world that we live in. Despite the commandment that God gives us over and over again to observe a Sabbath rest, we're not really very good at it. Christian life often feels just like a hurried rush to kind of take care of so much stuff, important stuff. So sometimes we interpret these verses and it's just like this invitation to the justification for a stressed out kind of life. We can defend it to ourselves and to others. After all, we're on a mission from God. The stakes couldn't be higher, and if we don't do the Lord's work, who's going to do it? It's kind of an invitation to kind of do that. Now, if that's our interpretation, then what Jesus says to the disciples might kind of come across as a little bit of a tough message. Instead of saying shake off your tiredness, pour yourself a cup of coffee or 4 and get back to work. Jesus says, you're exhausted. Come away to a secluded place and let's get some rest. The disciples were like, well, there are people to feed and there's so much to do, and yet Jesus invites them to come away to rest and offers them refreshment. It's interesting, too, is that what happens next is that many people saw them leaving. They saw them going away for rest, it says, and then recognized them. So they ran ahead from all the cities that arrived before them. When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. So here the disciples are. Jesus has kind of helped them, encouraged them, almost told them that they need to get away to a secluded place for a rest. And they get in this boat and they go away. And the crowd starts saying, hey, they're going. And they start running after them and jumping in their boats and following them along, I'm sure. And they seemingly are out to spoil the rest of the disciples and all that Jesus was about to do for them. But notice that Jesus doesn't scold the crowd for ruining all of this or messing up the disciples' needed rest. Jesus simply expands the offer. Jesus doesn't exclude the crowd from the rest he offered the disciples, nor does he exclude the disciples from the rest that he's offered to the crowd. Jesus simply opens it up to everyone here. And so we read on. And later in the day, the disciples came to Jesus, and all this crowd was happening. And this is where this miracle, the feeding of the multitudes, happens. It's an isolated place, and it's already late in the day, they say. Send them away so they can go to the countryside and villages and buy something to eat for themselves. And Jesus replied, you give them something to eat. And so they say, well, where in the world could we get that? It would take 8 months' pay and all this stuff. And so they said, Jesus said, how much bread do you have? And after checking, they said, well, 5 loaves and 2 fish. We don't get anything about a boy's lunch here and everything else. Like we said, they just got to do that. And so he directs the disciples to have the people sit in groups. And as they were having a banquet on the green grass, they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. And they took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, blessed them, broke them into pieces, and gave them to the disciples to eat, to set before the people, He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate until they were full. They filled 12 baskets with leftover pieces of bread and fish. About 5,000 had eaten. So the disciples here are worn out, they're tired, they've sent out on a mission, they've done all this stuff, they come back to Jesus. At first they're excited about all the things they've done. Then Jesus tells them, we need to go and rest, but then the crowds come and they kind of mess up all this stuff. And so Jesus kind of lets the crowd sit on the grass, and the disciples are kind of all there. And then he asks the disciples, as he does this miracle, to distribute the gifts that he's going to offer the people, the food. But notice that distributing these gifts does not include the disciples from receiving them as well. He divided the fish among them all, it says, and they all ate and were satisfied. So the disciples are receiving this gift of care that Jesus is offering, just like the crowds that are seated on the grass around them. And they all ate and satisfied and all got this stuff. So this, again, we go back to a miracle of Jesus, but it highlights that how Jesus kind of approaches kind of being a disciple and working and doing all that stuff. He multiplies this bread and this fish, and people can be physically fed. It really kind of this whole section of this kind of book, this part of the book, really talks about how Jesus is greatly concerned about not only our spiritual well-being, but our physical well-being as well. And that means we want to be fed, they want to be rested, all this kind of stuff. It's not just enough for us to understand that. Luke says in his gospel, the only verse we get that talks about Jesus growing up in those years is, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and with people. And that's the idea that Jesus grows spiritually and physically, and there's all of that is encompassed in what it means to mature in your faith. So Jesus is kind of thing. This story kind of reveals the heart of Jesus as well as his character. He's got compassion for people, and he recognizes the needs that we have, the physical as well as the spiritual needs that we have, and he addresses them. He also recognizes that we have limits and need rest. He knows the disciples have needed to rest. Maybe they need to rest because they were too focused on everything they had to do. And I think one of the challenges to being a disciple today is that it's really easy for me as the pastor of discipleship here to say, all right, if you're going to be a disciple, this is what you got to do. You got to do this, you got to do this. You got to read so many verses a day. You got to pray for so many time a day. You got to do this, you got to do this. You got to come to church this night. You got to do this. And so much of what we understand about discipleship is, what do I have to do? Do, like that. And Jesus is kind of almost reminding us that there is a rhythm to this, and there needs to be a little bit of the be part of that thing, where we're just kind of in the presence of Jesus and not just worrying about what we're accomplishing. So Jesus is ready to provide some things. So there are 3 things that are shown in this passage here. One is the disciples are excited about all the work they've been doing, and And until Jesus puts up kind of a hand gesture and says, all right, stop. That's great. Just stop. Slow down. The disciples get wide-eyed, seeing all the work they have to do as the crowd is kind of gathering in, and they can feel Jesus kind of feel their anxiety as they think, well, I thought you said we were going to rest. And then there's that moment when dinner is served and all the conversation has ceased and everyone is enjoying the food. And the disciples are sitting among the crowd, and you see just Jesus kind of smiling and delighting in the fact that everybody's being refreshed in a moment by this gift that he's just offered to everybody. I think it's a great little story that talks about not only the miracle of feeding the multitudes, but just the way in which Jesus cares for the entirety of people that are around him. And then it goes on. It says, right then Jesus made his disciples get in a boat and go to the other side of the lake and toward Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. Now the word there to make is a Greek word anagazo, and it means to force someone to do something. So the disciples probably argued with Jesus. They wanted to stay with him, and Jesus made them get into a boat by themselves and go to the other side of the lake. He had just performed this miracle of all these people, and now they're trying to make Jesus their king, it says in one of the other Gospels. And I don't think Jesus is like physically forcing them to do that, but he's firm and tells them they have to get in his boat and go to the other side. And it says, after saying goodbye to them, Jesus went up to the mountain to pray. I think it's very interesting in these stories and these times when Jesus does this, that Jesus kind of admits that even as the Son of God, even as the Messiah, even as Jesus Christ, he recognizes the need for him to get away and rest. And so my challenge for me is always, what makes me think that I'm any more important than that if I take some time to take care of myself and do those kind of things, that somehow it's gonna be a bad situation. So evening came and the boat was in the middle of the lake, but Jesus was alone on the land. He saw the disciples struggling. They were trying to row forward, but the wind was blowing against them. So very early in the morning, he came to them walking on the lake. He intended to pass them by. When they saw him walking by the lake, they thought he was a ghost, and they screamed. Seeing him was terrifying to all of them. Just then, Jesus spoke to them. Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid. So he gets in the boat, and the wind settles down. The disciples were so baffled, they were beside themselves. That's because they hadn't understood about the loaves. Their minds had been closed, so they resisted God's way. Very interesting. So the reason they didn't understand this, they didn't get it, was because they were confused about the loaves. They'd just seen Jesus take 5 loaves and 2 fish, and feed, probably 25,000 people. It was 5,000 was the men, so it was probably a huge crowd of people, and he's feeding them, and now he's just kind of they're scared because they see Jesus and they don't understand that he's able to do miraculous things. They're just not quite getting it. I mean, you think sometimes I always joke and say that when I was a kid growing up at my house in Louisville, I had a basketball goal in the back patio of my house, and I would always shoot baskets. And I remember saying countless times, I would stand there and I would say, all right, now if I make this shot, then God wants me to do this, or I'm going to do this, or whatever else, and I'd shoot my basket. And if I made it, all right. And if I wanted to make it, I made it or whatever. If I didn't get the answer I wanted, I'd go, best 2 out of 3, or best 3 out of 5, or whatever it was, just so I could kind of work it out. It's this idea that we're kind of trying to manipulate the situation, and yet we're watching this. And how many times have I said, God, if you would just show me. If you would just show me the answer, if you would just tell me what I'm supposed to do, I'll do it. Well, here, these disciples they're with the guy who's doing it. They're in the room where it happens, as Hamilton says, right? And they're still kind of not getting it, which is amazing to me that they don't quite understand it. And I wish I could tell you that when you come to Jesus, all your problems are going to be over. I wish I could tell you that when you give your life to God, it's all going to be smooth sailing. But this story makes it abundantly clear that that's not the way it is. Life is tough for everyone, including followers of Jesus. But I guess the thing about this story is the other thing it does is that as a follower of Jesus, we're never going to face the storms of life alone. Jesus spoke three things to them when he walked by. He said, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here." What that means is you are never out of God's sight. In the story, they're out there. He's watching them struggle and row and try to fight against the waves and watch them really be scared. And he's standing there on the shore and he's watching all this stuff happens. And it says, notice it says in the story that he doesn't, early in the morning he goes out there. So it's not like Jesus sees this and immediately runs up and, oh, help. It's almost like there's this sense in which he watches them. He knows they're okay. He knows they're fine. And he's going to watch them. Sort of like if you're a parent, sometimes you don't want to just swoop in and help your kid do something. You want to watch them struggle a little bit, and then you say, okay, now if you want me to, I can help you do this easy or whatever else. So I think that's there. But I think some people have the misconception that when you follow Jesus and you're doing God's will, that you're going to have fewer problems, and I don't think that's the way. I think sometimes God sends them into the storm. God sent the disciples out into the storm. God insists that you go ahead in a certain way and do a certain thing, and it's going to be difficult. But God needs you there, and so God sends us there. And God needed those disciples to go into that place. And I think Jesus made something very clear when he said, in John's Gospel, he says, "In this world you'll have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." I think Jesus is saying it's not going to be easy, but you're never going to encounter trouble with the storm without me being there. And I think, remember, Jesus went up on that mountaintop to pray. I think Jesus knows the importance of kind of being close to God, and even in the midst of struggles, he's ready for that. I think you're never out of God's sight. That while he may have been sitting on the storm, when the storm was raging and watching them, he was on the shore watching them. I don't think he was ever not aware of what was going on. You're always you're always in God's sight for that. The Lord is kind of aware of our situation and knows what's going on. Sometimes I think when we read prayer concerns on the cards on Sunday morning, there's sometimes when you read them, and I will tell you that Ryan and I have not fought for Rebecca not to read those, because we're fine with her reading those cards. She's been in this church her entire life. She knows the names better than any of us do. But it's always a challenge, because when you read those cards, if they put pray for my dear Aunt Sally, she's got breast cancer, or she's got this, or she's got that. I don't know if Sally wants everybody to know what's going on with her life. So how much do I say? And sometimes it's okay just to say, pray for Sally. And that's enough. We don't have to go into, a million having descriptions and everything else. And I think that's one of the things we know is that we're never out of God's sight. God is kind of always aware of that. Sometimes all we need to pray is, I want to pray for Sally. God, you know what's going on, and I'm not worried about it. Anything else. I think that's always good for that. So the Lord is kind of aware of our situation before it happens, and is always in control of that. Jesus had not abandoned his disciples to the storm. He knew exactly where they were, and he was ready to deliver them. You're never out of God's sight. I think you're never out of God's reach. Jesus goes walking them across the waves. I mean, he shows you're never out of God's reach. They weren't getting it. They did not know Jesus was watching them, and they were scared, and they were fighting and trying to do it on their own. And yet, I think it's why it says they were scared, because they didn't understand the miracle of the bread. Again, it doesn't really make sense, but they're not getting who Jesus really is. Jesus comes walking on the water to them. It's a true miracle. Notice in this story, one of the things that's interesting is that Mark does not have Peter walking on the water in this story. And in the other Gospels, there's this time when Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, let me come to you." And he has none of that in this story. It's just the miracle of him walking on the water. I think this harkens back to some understanding for Mark about who Jesus is. In the Old Testament, only God walked on the water and had the power over the sea. Job says God alone has spread out the heavens and marches on the waves of the sea. By performing this miracle, I think Mark is telling us that Jesus is God in the flesh. It's a way of saying, you're not getting it. The miracle of the bread, you didn't understand this. You're not getting it. But this is who this guy is. He's God himself. I also think it's interesting in this story that it says, Mark says, that Jesus intended to go past them. He just intended to go. That's an odd statement to throw in there. What does it mean? Why is it important? Well, at first glance, it means like Jesus is like going to walking by the boat, going, "Hey guys, what's up?" and kind of walking on, and not making anything about it, not thinking he's going to get involved or anything else, and it just kind of intends to leave them panicked and struggling, and while he continues to walk like a ghost, they say, on the water. But the English phrase that we translate there, intended to go past them, means one thing. But in Greek, when the original readers would have heard it, they would have had a special kind of a significance for them. It signals a rare but powerful kind of remembrance of a story about God at Mount Sinai, when Moses is up on Mount Sinai and sees the burning bush. Where he says, "God, I can't look at you because," and it says, "Well, turn your, and I will walk past you." And so it's like this thing. It's like it's a way in which God is, in order to reveal himself to Moses, he's walking past him. Again, at Mount Horeb, the Lord revealed his presence to Elijah, and he said he passed by. It's this phrase for someone who knew what was going on and knew these kind of stories and these turn of phrases where they would have, when God would pass by someone, it was a way of saying God is revealing himself. We might say something similar like, "Hey, I'm going to come here. I'm going to come by your house today." And come by doesn't mean I'm simply going to drive by your house and not going to stop. It means I'm going to come by your house today. I'm going to come by and knock on your door, and you can come in and whatever, talk for a while. That's what it means. It doesn't mean I'm going to come by your house. It means I'm going to come over to your house. And I think the phrase "to pass by" is what they use to refer to God revealing himself. So Jesus is going to pass by in order to reveal something about himself. And think about this. So why, when they say you're scared, Jesus criticizes them and calls them out for not understanding the miracle of the bread. If Jesus is kind of, and the whole idea of Mark's gospel is people not getting it, not fully understanding things, Jesus is passing by, intending to reveal himself to them. He's almost like this reminder of, why are you scared? Do you not know who I am? And it's this idea. And Jesus is intending to reveal himself to who he is as God. And even though he was doing that, his disciples didn't recognize him. When Mark tells us that when they saw him walking in the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified. Storms in life have the ability to terrify us and cry out even when we think Jesus might be with us in storms. The word "ghost" there is the word in the language is the word phantasma, from which we get the word phantom, and it refers to any kind of apparition type. It's not like a Halloween ghost kind of idea. It's this idea that it's like there's a they don't call them UFOs anymore. It's something else. There's some other acronym, but it's an unidentified flying object. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a spaceship. It could be anything else. It just means we don't know what it is, right? And that's how we kind of do that. During this time, it's kind of like this idea of, they're not saying it's a ghost like on Scooby-Doo or something like that. It's an apparition of something that we're doing. So during that time, a popular superstition was that spirits would bring disaster, and the disciples were ready for the worst. They were experiencing the worst. Also notice that after they yelled at each other for the night, through the middle of the storm, they were rowing, row harder, and all the things. They're yelling at each other. Their voices got to be tired. They yelled in horror. They cried out in terror. They were all terrified. The word "terrified" there means they were thrown into a panic. They were struck with dread, all the way the word is translated. They had been already afraid of the storm, and now they see this ghostly figure walking toward them on the water, and their fear is just over. So Jesus says, don't be afraid. Take courage. It's me. And I think that's it. We're never out of God's sight. You're never out of God's reach. And then you're never out of God's care. Jesus is not going to leave them there out in the storm. He's going to take care of them. Notice in verse 50 of that story, Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here. And when he climbed into the boat, the wind stopped. So it wasn't just... Jesus, it's like Martha, when Lazarus has died and Jesus goes to the tomb, and she says, Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother would have died. And Jesus weeps. And Jesus weeps there not because he's upset because his friend Lazarus is dead. He's upset because they're still not getting it. They're still not understanding that Jesus is the resurrection of the life. That Jesus is about life, not death. And they're really struggling there. And these disciples, he's going to pass by them and reveal himself to them. And if you had really understood who Jesus was while you're in the midst of the storm, then you wouldn't have been as terrified. And you wouldn't have worried for your life in the midst of that. Because Jesus is there. He's walking past them. He's going to reveal himself to them. Hey, remember, I'm the guy that just fed thousands of people with a little boy's lunch. You know, I'm the guy who did this stuff. And Jesus kind of steps in the boat, and the wind kind of... Yes, it's much calmer when Jesus is in the boat with us. But that doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes we just need to know that he's there in the midst of the storm that's raging all around us. And that needs to be the comfort and the care that we need to receive in the midst of that. So, when you're surrounded by chaos, confusion, drowning in your own fear and misunderstanding, God's going to speak to us. He's going to start where we are. We listen for him. He'll speak to us through his word. He'll speak to us maybe through a godly friend. His Holy Spirit will come to us. He'll say through things like, don't be afraid, take courage, I'm here. So he confronts his disciples with these statements, and Mark tells us that he climbs in the boat and the wind stopped. Again, I really appreciate how Mark kind of says this simply. He got in the boat and the wind stopped. That was it. And I think that's great. When he walks across the water, there's not just a lot of kind of other kind of stuff in Mark's gospel. It's like, this is what Jesus does. He walks on water, he climbs in a boat, the wind stops. It's like, don't you get it? That's what Mark is saying to us. Jesus climbed in the boat and the wind stopped. I think Mark wants us to know and understand, to get Jesus as a person who has control over all this stuff, over the food that we eat, and over the weather around us, and over all the things that are raging around us in life. Jesus has got control over this. That's who Mark wants us to know Jesus is. And he's around people that aren't getting it. The crowds seated on that hillside when Jesus fed them didn't get it. The disciples didn't get it when they were in the boat. When they didn't understand the miracle of the bread, they didn't get it. And I think sometimes they need to understand that that's kind of what's going on. Mark wraps up this section by saying they were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of loaves. Their hearts were too hard to just take it all in. They were totally amazed. When I was on sabbatical several years ago, I took a 6-week sabbatical and went away. And one of the things I did on my sabbatical time was I read through the New Testament a few times. Every day I would read for a couple hours. I would just read the New Testament as much as I could, and then a couple times. And I read it through several times over those 6 weeks. And one of the times I was reading it through, I noticed in the translation I was reading that I kept seeing the word amazed, amazed, amazed throughout the Gospels. And they were amazed, and the crowds were amazed, and they were amazed, and he did a thing that was amazing. And I was caught by that, this idea of, and the question I started to ask myself is, how often am I just amazed by God? How often do I just think, oh, this is just what, or am I amazed by this? And I think that's an important thing for us to think about. Are we amazed that this happened? The disciples were growing and they were learning. However, Mark tells us they still didn't understand the significance of what was going on. They weren't quite getting it. They didn't understand fully that Jesus was the Son of God, that he could do anything. Lack of resources didn't stop him. Circumstances didn't affect him in the least. In the midst of all the trials and the temptations and the storms and all the lack of everything else, he's God and he can take care of it all. And Mark wants us to know that's who Jesus really is. That's why Mark tells us the disciples didn't understand the miracle of the loaves because their hearts were too hard to take it in. I think they thought they knew a lot about Jesus, but they really didn't know what was going on there. They really didn't know the greater part of the story. So I think that's an important thing for us to learn. When you study God in the Bible, throughout the Bible, you're going to discover that he is all-knowing, all-present, all-powerful. Those are the omnis that we talk about God. God is omniscient. God is omnipresent. God is omnipotent. The word omni means all. So omniscient means all-knowing. Omnipresent means all-present. Omnipotent means all-powerful. So, again, lines up with these parts of Mark's gospel. You're never out of God's sight because God is all-knowing. You're never out of God's reach because God is all-present. You're never out of God's care because God is all-powerful. It also means that when you're never out of God's sight, that means God has never forgotten you. You're never out of God's reach, that means God is not abandoning you. And when you're never out of God's care, that means God is not stopping loving you. That's the miracle of this story, really, is this idea that of understanding. Mark wants us to understand that. So they get to the other side of the boat, and they cross the lake, and they anchor the boat, and they came ashore, and people immediately began to recognize Jesus, and ran around the whole region, bringing sick people on their mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, to villages, to cities, or farming communities, they would place the sick in the marketplaces and beg him to allow them to touch even the hem of his clothing. Everyone who touched him was healed. Now, interesting, in the other Gospels, there's stories about how this woman with the blood affliction the crowd just reached out and touched the hem of Jesus' garment, and Jesus said, "Who? Well, the power just left from me. Who touched me?" And all this other stuff, and it kind of gets real detailed. Mark just kind of says there were lots of people around, and they were all just trying. If I can just touch the hem of the garment, I'll be fine. If I can just, and everyone who touched him was healed. So it wasn't just like this one woman who this happened to. This kind of was something going on. With the mounting popularity of Jesus comes the mounting opposition for some of the leaders. When the Pharisees and some legal experts from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they saw that some of his disciples were eating food with unclean hands. They were eating without first really ritually purifying their hands through washing. The Pharisees and all the Jews wouldn't eat without first washing their hands carefully. This is a way of observing the rules handed down from the elders. And upon returning from the marketplace, they don't eat without first immersing themselves. And they would observe many other rules that had been handed down, such as the washing of cups and jugs and pans and sleeping mats. All that stuff is probably, in Mark's gospel, is probably kind of added in. It's kind of, in our translation, it's kind of a parenthetical statement. Some of that stuff may have been added in later. Mark probably, that's a lot of detail for the rest of Mark's gospel.
Were women involved in all of this ritualistic things, or was it just men?
There were a set of rules and regulations that women had to follow, especially obviously around things like menstrual cycles and things like that, where they had to purify themselves after those kind of experiences and other things they would do. And if they, whether it was through
wasn't necessarily these guys washing their hands.
There were some of the things that they had to do, and they had to when they had to do it to kind of prepare the food too, as well as when they would get ready for that. So, but the Pharisees asked the legal experts, and legal experts asked Jesus, "Why are your disciples not living according to the rules handed down from the elders, but instead eat food with ritually unclean hands?" So the Pharisees object to the way that Jesus' disciples are doing it. No, remember, in this culture, the way a rabbi would educate a student is that they would follow the rabbi around and they would learn to do everything just like the rabbi. So they would learn to eat like the rabbi, talk like the rabbi, walk like the rabbi. And so they would eat like the rabbi. Jesus was not following these rules, evidently, and they were not learning to do it either. And I think Jesus here has kind of exposes the hypocrisy of this, that these rules were handed down from the elders. They weren't from God, and Jesus doesn't want us to follow anything external. Now, what I always say is like there are ways in which every denomination, brand of Christianity around us does things. They're different, and I don't think any one of them are wrong necessarily. I just think there's some that are this is obviously more comfortable for me and where I am and where I have learned to follow Jesus. But what it means is it's not wrong for us to have all the instruments we have on any given Sunday morning and nothing else. But if we went out of College Hills Church of Christ, that would be wrong because that's a part of their tradition and a part of the way they do stuff. I don't agree with it. I wouldn't want to be a part of that because that's not how I understand things. But that's not make it where it's necessarily a wrong and a way against what God would have us do. I just don't think that's the thing I would stress about following Jesus. But in different traditions, in different habits, those things work. And so we create our own things. And those things are more man-made than they are handed down from God. There are a few things that I think God says, yes, this is what we should do. Wesley would say, we may not all think alike, but we should all learn to love alike. He can say things like, in essentials, unity, and non-essentials, liberty, which means you should have the freedom to do things that aren't the way you feel led to do them, that aren't necessarily essential. And so I think that's important lesson for us as Christians, is to learn to kind of get along with that kind of stuff and not stress that out too much. Jesus is telling them, you ignore God's commandment while holding on to rules created by humans and handed down to you. Clearly, you are experts at rejecting God's commandments in order to establish these rules. Now, the challenge is that none of the things that we do with any of these habits for any different brand of our Christianity around, if they're in opposition to the commands of God, then yes, there's a problem. And there are traditions that I would say that struggle in this area around our world that have in the past and do so, but I don't think that's there's not too many of them around as much around here. I don't agree with their stance on things. I may not agree with their interpretation of some things. I may not agree on the role of women in their thing in their church. All kinds of things like that can be different. I don't think it's going to keep you from the gates of heaven. That's what I guess what I want to say. So, he says, Moses said, honor your father and mother, and the person who speaks against father and mother will certainly be put to death. But you say, if you tell your father or mother everything I'm expected to contribute to you is korban, that is a gift I'm giving to God, then you are no longer required to care for them. So you can say, well, I'm supposed to care for you. I'm in the process now of redoing one of the bathrooms in my house so that my mother-in-law can move in with us. It'd be like me saying, I decided that instead of spending that money that you are going to help me on this thing, I'm going to give that to the church. I'm going to give that to God. I'm going to call it korban. I'm going to give it a gift to God. That's kind of how you would do that. And then I'm excused from using any kind of my resources to help out your parents. That's kind of an interesting kind of thing. And they came up with a way around a command of God, one of the 10 commandments of God. They came up with a way around it to make it seem like it's okay to do that. And I think that Jesus is bothered by that, rightfully so, I would say. So So he calls them hypocrites and says that there are traditions or rules that you honor and try to legislate obedience to God when you actually are using those things to get around really obeying God. And then Jesus says this very interesting thing, which I think is also kind of a stress of a way in which the culture wasn't getting it. And I think we still struggle as a culture to get a lot of this. Then Jesus called the crowd again and said, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. Understand. Get it. Nothing outside of a person can enter and contaminate a person in God's sight. Rather, the things that come out of a person contaminate the person." We concentrate so much in the religious world about the external things that happen instead of what comes out of us. I am more bothered in my own attempt at discipleship when I lose my temper and say things and do things that I'm ashamed that I'm doing than I am about the things that happen around me and that I'm experiencing. Watching a certain thing or listening to a song or something like that. Less of that bothers me as much as I know that what happens is that if I'm not careful, I can let that stuff come out of me in ways that are inappropriate. And so that's why I think you avoid certain things, because it takes you in a place that it takes you to expressions of things that you shouldn't do. I always say I listen to a lot of different variety of music, from hard rock music to classic rock music to jazz music to Christian music to everything else, country music. I listen to it all, and when I listen to it, I can tell when I listen to too much of a certain kind of music, because I start to kind of get a little amped up and get a little ready to go, and I have to be careful about that. Not because there's anything wrong with that music, but because I know how it affects me. So I have to be mindful of it. So I have to sometimes get in my truck and I have to turn the radio to a different station, put on a different playlist on my iTunes or whatever else, and say, all right, I'm going to listen to this kind of music for a while because I need to calm my spirit. I think it's less about being restrictive and more about just allowing those things to speak into our hearts so that we're careful about what comes out of us when we do that. And that's kind of what Jesus kind of ends and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot more we can get into in this, and I've got a lot more text in there, but I think I've used up my time, and I want to kind of honor that. But there's a lot in this section of Mark's Gospel that reminds us that it's not only just the crowds, the occasional disciples who get it. It's the guys who live with Jesus day in and day out through his ministry that didn't always get what Jesus was really talking about. And I don't think they ever really got it until after the resurrection. And then they can look back and go, oh, okay, now I understand what Jesus was saying. And that's why they were able to lead the church in the way they were as in that early kind of time. All right. Well, that's the end of our session for today.